A crowbar bit into an old wooden floorboard and pulled. The nails screamed. The plank came up with a crack that echoed through the empty building. Then another. And another. An old man knelt in the dust, breathing hard, one hand pressed to his bad knee. He set the crowbar down. He leaned forward over the black gap he'd opened in the floor. And he went very still. Because down there, in the dark, under 50 years of dust, something was looking back up at him. His name was Walter Boyd. He was 74 years old. 3 weeks ago his own children had thrown him out of the house he'd paid for, and this crumbling mill was the only roof left in the world with his name on it. What Walter found under that floor would change everything. But not the way you think. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up. Because to understand what Walter found under that floor, you have to understand how a decorated war veteran ended up on his knees in an abandoned mill in the first place. Walter Boyd had spent his whole life giving. That was the simplest way to say it. He'd given 2 years of his youth to a war on the other side of the world, and come home with a bad knee and a box of medals he never took out of the closet. He'd given 40 years to a factory job, standing on concrete floors until his back gave out, so his family could have a house and a yard and second chances. And most of all, he'd given everything he had to his 3 children. Every dollar he ever saved. Every ounce of himself. Let me tell you one small thing about Walter, so you understand the kind of man we're talking about. Back when the kids were young, there was a winter the factory laid half the men off, and money got tight, tighter than Walter ever let on. In that Christmas, Walter went without a coat. A grown man, in the cold, walking to the bus stop every morning in nothing but a work shirt, because he'd taken the money a new coat would have cost and spent it on presents for 3 children who never once noticed their father was cold. That was Walter. That was the whole man, right there. He'd freeze before he'd let his kids go without. And he never said a word about it, not for 40 years. His wife, Ruth, had passed 6 years back. Cancer. She'd been the light of his life, and when she went, a lot of Walter went with her. But he still had the kids. Or he thought he did. 3 of them. 2 sons and a daughter, all grown now, all with families of their own. Now here's the thing you have to understand about Walter, and it's the thing that broke him in the end. He trusted them. Completely. When his oldest son, Greg, sat him down 2 years ago and said, "Dad, you're getting older, let us help you manage things," Walter didn't hesitate. He signed papers. He put the house in a family trust. He handed over control of his savings, his pension paperwork, all of it, because Greg said it was smarter for taxes, and because a father wants to believe his children have his best interest at heart. For a while, it was fine. Walter lived in the house he'd owned for 40 years. The grandkids came by. Life was quiet, but it was good. Then things started to change. Slow at first. The visits got shorter. Then rarer. Greg stopped answering the phone on the first try. Walter's daughter, Carol, moved 2 states away and called less and less. And his younger son, Danny, well, Danny was always in some kind of money trouble, and Walter started noticing that the family savings he'd handed over never seemed to be there when he asked about them. He told himself he was imagining it. He told himself his kids were just busy. That's what good parents do. They make excuses for their children long past the point where the excuses make any sense. And then came the Sunday that ended it all. The 3 of them showed up at the house together. That was the first sign something was wrong. They never came together. Greg did the talking, the way he always did. He sat Walter down at the kitchen table, the same table where Ruth used to serve Sunday dinner, and he explained, in that calm, reasonable voice, that the family had made a decision. The house was being sold. It was too big for one old man. The upkeep was a burden. They'd found a nice facility, Greg said, a place for people Walter's age, and they'd already put down the deposit. It was all arranged. Walter just needed to pack a bag. Walter sat there and listened to his son explain, in polite words, that he was being removed from his own life. And here's the part that still gets me. Walter didn't even argue about the house. Not really. What he asked, in a quiet voice, was about the money. The savings. The 40 years of work. Where was it? And the three of them looked at each other, and nobody would meet his eyes, and Greg said something about investments not working out, and market conditions, and Walter understood, all at once, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table, that it was gone. All of it. Spent. His children had spent his life savings, and now they were putting him in a home to get him out of the way. He looked at their faces. His own children. And he saw no shame there. Just impatience. They wanted this over with. So Walter stood up. He was 74 years old, and his knee hurt, and his heart was breaking in his chest, but he stood up straight, the way the army had taught him a lifetime ago. And he said he would not be going to any facility. And he went upstairs and packed a single duffel bag with what few things were truly his. A photo of Ruth. His medals, for the first time out of that closet. A change of clothes. And he walked out of the house he'd paid for with 40 years of his back, and he did not look back, because he did not want them to see him cry. Now, if you've ever given everything to someone and watched them decide you were a burden. If you've ever learned the hard way that blood does not always mean loyalty. Then you already understand the weight Walter carried out that door. And if you're still with me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what happened to Walter after he walked out is the reason this story is worth telling. Walter had nowhere to go. Let's be honest about that. A man doesn't keep a lot of friends into his 70s, and the ones he had were mostly gone. A cheap motel would eat his pension in a month. He sat in his old truck in a parking lot that first night and he thought hard, and he came up with exactly one thing in this world that still belonged to him. The mill. His father had owned it, back before Walter was born. An old grist mill on the edge of a river, on the edge of town, that had ground grain into flour for the whole county once, 100 years ago. It had shut down when Walter was a boy. His father had held onto the deed out of stubbornness, and when he died, it had passed to Walter, and Walter had held onto it out of the same stubbornness, and paid the tiny property tax on it every year without ever once setting foot inside. It was worthless. Condemned. A ruin. Nobody had wanted it in 50 years. But it was his. Free and clear. The one thing his children hadn't gotten their hands on, because they hadn't known it was worth taking. So Walter drove out there. And he stood in front of that old mill in the gray afternoon light, this crumbling wreck of stone and timber, with its great wooden water wheel gone still and rotten, and he thought, well, it's a roof. And a man can survive a winter under a roof. That first night was the hardest night of Walter's life, and he had survived a war, so that is saying something. He lay on the cold floor of that ruined mill, wrapped in an army blanket, 74 years old, listening to the wind find every crack in the walls. And the thoughts came for him in the dark. Every thought a betrayed man has. He thought about the 40 years of double shifts. He thought about going coatless in the snow. He thought about all of it, given freely, to 3 people who had sat at his wife's kitchen table and decided he was a line item to be removed. And Walter, who had not let himself break down even walking out the door, lay in the dark of that mill and finally let it come. He was not too proud to cry when there was no one left to see it. But here's the thing about a man like Walter. Even at the very bottom, some stubborn ember in him refused to go out. He was Ruth's husband. He was his father's son. And men like that do not lie down in the cold and quit. So in the morning, red-eyed and aching, Walter Boyd got up. And he got to work. That was all he wanted. To survive the winter. To have a place his children couldn't reach, where he could lick his wounds and figure out what was left of his life. He had no idea, standing there, that the mill was about to give him back everything they'd taken. And more. The inside was worse than the outside. 40 years of dust and animal nests and rotted grain sacks. But the walls were sound, and the roof held, mostly, and Walter Boyd had survived worse places in the war. He set up a cot in a corner. He got the old wood stove working. He hauled water from the river. And slowly, day by day, he made the place livable. And it was on the 9th day, while he was tearing up a section of rotten floorboard near the old grinding stones, meaning only to patch a hole so the wind stopped coming through, that his crowbar caught on something that wasn't floor. There was a space under there. A hollow. Deliberate. Not the natural gap under a floor, but a compartment, framed in old timber, hidden beneath the boards where the miller used to stand. Walter's heart started to pound, and he told himself to slow down, that it was probably nothing, probably an old rat's nest, and he pried up board after board until he'd opened a black rectangle in the floor the size of a coffin. And that's where we came in. Walter Boyd, on his knees in the dust, leaning over a hole in the floor of a mill his father had left him. Looking down at something looking back up at him in the dark. It was a metal box. A strong box, old and heavy, the kind they don't make anymore. And beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, were bundles. A lot of them. Walter reached down with shaking hands and lifted the box out. It was heavy. He set it on the floor and worked the latch, and it took some doing, because it hadn't been opened in a very long time. And when the lid finally came up, Walter Boyd sat back on his heels and forgot how to breathe. Money. Old money, banded in paper wrappers, filling the box to the top. And it wasn't the only thing. There were coins, gold ones, in little canvas sacks. There were certificates, the old kind, stock certificates and bearer bonds. And there were papers. But before I tell you what those papers said, I have to tell you about the wrapped bundles beside the box. Because Walter opened one of those next, peeling back the stiff oilcloth. And inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to Walter. All in his father's handwriting. And all of them, every single one, unopened. Now, before I go on, I need you to sit with how strange that was. Walter's father had been dead for over 30 years. And here, hidden under the floor of an abandoned mill, was a fortune, and a stack of letters written to a son who had never seen them. Why hide money under a floor? Why write letters and never send them? What was Walter's father hiding, and who was he hiding it from? Walter picked up the first letter with hands that would not stop shaking. He opened it. And he began to read. And what he read there, in his father's careful hand, turned the whole story of his family upside down. The letters told a story Walter had never known. His father, it turned out, had not been a poor man scraping by on a dead mill, the way Walter had always believed. His father had been a careful, quiet man who had made money, real money, over a lifetime, through hard work and shrewd investments in land he'd bought cheap and held. And he had not trusted banks, not after living through the Depression as a boy. So he had done what men of that generation sometimes did. He had turned his wealth into cash and gold and bonds, and he had hidden it, in the one place he knew no thief would ever think to look. A worthless, condemned old mill that nobody wanted. And the letters explained why he'd never told Walter. His father had watched Walter grow into a generous man. A soft-hearted man. A man who would give the shirt off his back. And his father had been afraid, deeply afraid, that if Walter got his hands on that fortune, he would simply give it all away. To his children. To anyone who asked. His father wrote, in one letter, "You have the biggest heart I ever knew, son. And the world eats men with big hearts alive. I could not bear to watch you hand this away to people who would not value it." So his father had made a plan. He would leave the mill to Walter, and the fortune inside it, but he would not tell him. Not yet. He wrote that he was waiting. Waiting for the right time. Waiting until Walter was older, until his children were grown and shown for who they truly were, until Walter would finally understand that not everyone who shares your blood deserves your trust. He never got the chance. Walter's father died suddenly, of a heart attack, before he ever told his son the secret. The letters were his insurance. He had left instructions, Walter learned, with an old lawyer in town, that if anything ever happened to Walter, if he ever fell on hard times, the lawyer was to tell him to look in the mill. But the lawyer had died 2 years back, and the instruction had died with him, and the secret had sat under that floor for over 3 decades, waiting. There was one letter, near the bottom of the stack, that Walter would read 100 times over the years that followed. In it, his father wrote as if he somehow knew exactly what was coming, decades before it did. One day, his father had written, the people you gave everything to will show you who they really are. It happens to soft-hearted men. It happened to me. And when it does, son, you'll feel like a fool, and you'll feel like everything you gave was wasted. It wasn't. The giving was never the mistake. The mistake is thinking the world owes you the same back. It doesn't. So here's what I've left you, for the day the world takes more than it gives. Not so you can buy your way back into anyone's heart, but so that you never have to bow your head to people who don't deserve it. A man should be able to stand up straight at the end. This is me, making sure you can. Waiting until a broken old man, cast out by his own children, came home to the one place that was left, and pulled up a floorboard. Walter sat in that dusty mill for a long time, holding his father's letters, and he wept. Not for the money. He wept for his father, who had loved him so much and understood him so well that he had hidden a fortune to protect him from his own generous heart. He wept because his father had been right. If Walter had been handed that money at 50, he'd have given it to Greg and Carol and Danny, and they'd have spent it, and there would be nothing left. His father had seen it all coming, 30 years before it happened. Now, here's where the story turns, and here's where you find out what kind of man Walter Boyd really was. Because a lesser man, holding a fortune, freshly betrayed, would have gone straight for revenge. Would have marched into a lawyer's office and cut his children off and burned every bridge. And believe me, Walter thought about it. He thought about it a long time, sitting in that mill. But that is not what Walter did. The first thing Walter did was count it. It took him 2 days, and when he was done, he sat down heavily, because the number was more than he could truly understand. His father's fortune, cash and gold and bonds together, and the bonds had been quietly accruing value for decades, came to just over $2 million. More money than Walter had made in 40 years at the factory. More money than his children had stolen, many times over. Walter sat on his cot in that cold mill and looked at the strongbox and had a strange, quiet thought. 3 weeks ago he had walked out of his own house with a duffel bag, believing he was the poorest man in the county. And the whole time, this had been sitting under a floor 20 minutes away, with his name on the deed above it. His father had made sure of it. Even the timing felt like his father's hand, reaching out across 30 years, waiting until the exact moment his son needed it most. The second thing Walter did was hire a lawyer. A good one, a young sharp woman 2 towns over who had no connection to his family. He had the fortune verified, catalogued, and secured. He had the mill and the surrounding land properly surveyed, and it turned out the land itself, riverfront acreage on the edge of a growing town, was worth a great deal more than anyone had realized. And then Walter did the thing that tells you everything. He did not call his children to gloat. He did not tell them what he'd found. Instead, he had his lawyer look, quietly, into exactly what his children had done. And what she found made even the theft of his savings look small. Greg, it turned out, had not just spent Walter's money. He had forged Walter's signature on documents. He had taken out a loan against the house in Walter's name. He had, in the cold language of the law, committed fraud against his own father. And the facility they'd tried to put Walter in was the cheapest, grimmest one in the county, a place where the state would eventually seize whatever pension Walter had left. They hadn't just wanted him gone. They'd wanted him gone cheap, and quiet, and forgotten. Walter had the evidence. He could have sent his oldest son to prison. His lawyer told him, plainly, that he had grounds. That most men in his position would. Walter thought about Ruth. About what she would have wanted. And he made his choice. He did not send Greg to prison. But he did not let it go either. What Walter did was write a new will, and set up his affairs, with the cold clarity of a man who has finally learned the lesson his father tried to teach him. He kept a portion of the fortune for himself. Enough to live the rest of his life in comfort and dignity, on his own terms, for the first time in his life. He restored the mill, not as a home, but as something better. He turned it into a small museum and a working demonstration mill, a piece of the county's history brought back to life, with his father's name on a plaque by the door. He created jobs. He gave the town back a piece of itself. and the restoration itself became a kind of medicine for Walter. For the first time in years, he had a purpose that got him out of bed. He worked alongside the young carpenters and masons, teaching them things his own father had taught him, learning things they knew that he didn't. The great water wheel turned again for the first time in 50 years, groaning and then finding its rhythm, and Walter stood in the river spray and laughed like a boy. Word spread. People drove out from 3 counties over to see the old mill grinding flour again, and to meet the veteran who'd brought it back. And every single one of them treated Walter Boyd with more respect in 5 minutes than his own children had shown him in 20 years. He was somebody again. Not because of the money. Because he'd made something instead of just giving something away. Then he dealt with his children. He called the 3 of them to the lawyer's office. They came, and Walter could see it on their faces, the nervousness, the wondering what the old man wanted, maybe the faint hope that he'd forgiven them and there was more money to be had. He let them sit. And then he told them, calmly, everything he knew. The forged signature. The loan. The fraud. He watched the blood drain from Greg's face. He watched Carol start to cry, and Danny start to babble excuses. And Walter held up one hand, the way his own father might have, and they went silent. Greg tried, at the end, the only card he had left. He said, Dad, we're your children. Whatever we did, we're still your blood. That has to count for something. And Walter looked at his oldest son for a long moment. And then he said the truest thing he had ever said to any of them. Blood counts for a lot, Greg, he said quietly. It's why I gave you 40 years without ever once asking for anything back. It's why I trusted you with everything I had. Blood is exactly why what you did is so much worse than if a stranger had done it. A stranger owes you nothing. You owed me everything. And you looked at the man who went cold in the snow so you could have Christmas, and you decided he was garbage to be put out. He shook his head slowly. No. Blood doesn't save you here. Blood is what you spent. He told them he would not be pressing charges. Not because they deserved his mercy. They did not. But because he was Ruth's husband, and Ruth would not have wanted her children in prison, and Walter would honor his wife even now. But, he told them, the price of that mercy was this. He was done. There was a fortune, yes. They had probably guessed that by now. And not one of them would ever see a single dollar of it. It was going into a trust, for his grandchildren, the innocent ones, to be used for their education and their future, administered by people who were not their parents. And the parents themselves were cut off. Completely. Forever. My father hid this money from me, Walter told them, because he was afraid I'd give it to people who didn't deserve it. He knew me better than I knew myself. And he knew you, I think, before you were even born. So I'm going to do the one thing he trusted me to do. I'm going to make sure his life's work does not get thrown away on people who threw away their own father. He stood up. You have grandchildren of mine to raise. Raise them better than you turned out. That's the only thing I'll ever ask of you again. And he walked out. And this time, he did not cry. Walter Boyd lived 9 more years, and they were the best of his life. He never remarried, but he was not lonely. The town took to him, the old veteran who'd brought the mill back to life. Schoolchildren came on field trips, and Walter would show them how the great stone wheels ground grain into flour, and tell them stories, and they loved him. The young lawyer who'd helped him became a real friend, and brought her own children by, and they called him Grandpa Walt, and meant it more than his own blood ever had. He kept his father's letters in a frame on the wall of the mill. All of them, the read ones now. And every so often, an old man would stand in front of them and have a quiet word with a father who had loved him enough to hide a fortune under a floor and wait 30 years for him to find it. His grandchildren, the ones the trust protected, grew up and went to college on their great-grandfather's money, and 2 of them came back to help run the mill, and they knew the whole story, and they were not ashamed of Walter. They were ashamed of their parents. And Walter never poisoned them against their own mothers and fathers. He just lived, in the open, a good and honest life, and let the children see for themselves the difference between the old man in the mill and the people who had put him out. There was one granddaughter, Emma, Greg's youngest, who took it hardest of all. She was 16 when she learned what her father had done to her grandfather, and she showed up at the mill one afternoon on her bicycle, having ridden 8 miles, and she stood in the doorway and cried and apologized for a thing that was never hers to apologize for. And Walter sat that girl down and made her hot cocoa on the old wood stove, and he told her the one thing he most needed her to understand. "You are not your father's mistakes," he told her. "You get to decide, every single day, what kind of person you're going to be. That's the only inheritance that ever really matters." Emma grew up to be a nurse. She named her first son Walter. And she was holding the old man's hand the day he died. As for Greg and Carol and Danny, they did not prosper. Money taken by theft rarely lasts, and theirs was long gone. They grew old themselves, in reduced circumstances, and if they ever felt shame for what they'd done, Walter never heard about it, because he never spoke to them again. The day Walter Boyd died, he died in a bed in the loft of the mill his father had left him, with the sound of the river outside the window and a framed photo of Ruth on the table beside him. He was 83. His grandchildren were with him. His blood, but the good kind, the kind he'd chosen to invest in. They say his last words were to Emma, holding his hand. He looked at her, and he smiled, and he said, "Tell them I wasn't a fool for giving. Tell them I just gave to the wrong people, for a while. In the end, I got it right." And then he closed his eyes, and the river ran on outside the window the way it had for 100 years. They buried him out by the mill, next to a stone he'd had set for his father years before, a stone that read, "For the man who knew his son's heart, and guarded it." The day his children threw him out, Walter Boyd walked out of a house with a single duffel bag, believing he had nothing left in the world. He was wrong. He had one old mill, and a father who had loved him from beyond the grave, and a heart that even betrayal could not turn hard. And in the end, that turned out to be everything a man could ever need.